When states have a heightened sense of risk, they resort to more indirect forms of warfare.
What is grey zone warfare? What does it look like today? And how does it differ from perhaps irregular warfare or proxy conflicts that maybe we saw during the Cold War?
Populist narratives in the West are undermining efforts to tackle disinformation.
But as we've sadly seen since 2016, there really has been this blurred line between what's fact checking, what's censorship, what's just outright bullying. Hi, I'm Dominic Bowen, and welcome back to the International Risk Podcast, where we explore the risks that are shaping our world and the decisions that are confronting governments, business leaders, and academic institutions. And today, we're turning to a topic that increasingly defines the strategic environment, and we're talking about grey zone warfare. These are the tactics that operate really in the shadows. They're below the threshold of open warfare, yet clearly above the level of peace. And this includes cyber operations, election interference, disinformation campaigns, and increasingly what we're seeing is things like sabotage and the use of state and non-state actors to achieve government objectives, but without triggering that full-scale military confrontation that we're all used to or have at least seen in movies. Now, in a world where we see everything managed so carefully, the question really begs answering about how are governments managing this? How are alliances and traditional and even some of the newer alignments responding and managing these, and how do societies and businesses defend their interests against these threats that are certainly out there, and we see them in the news and many of us are working with them every day, but they're occurring in that grey space in between. To help us unpack this topic, we're joined by one of the UK's really foremost experts on the topic, and that's Professor Andrew Mumford. Professor Mumford, he works at the University of Nottingham, and he's the first professor of war studies there, and his research really examines how states manage contemporary and historical conflicts, with a particular focus on insurgency, counterinsurgency, proxy warfare, and even military strategy. He's the author of The Counterinsurgency Myth, the British Experience of Irregular Warfare, and his most recent book from 2021 is The West's War Against ISIS, and we'll link to those books in the show notes. Professor Andrew Mumford, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Dominic, thanks for having me on.
We speak a lot about hybrid warfare and grey zone warfare in so many different contexts on the International Risk Podcast. It could be when we're talking about trade policy. It could be when we talk about some big cyber attacks. It could be when we talk about water treaties and how states are responding or not responding to their treaty obligations with regards to natural resources. Can you help us understand what is grey zone warfare? What does it look like today? And how does it differ from perhaps irregular warfare or proxy conflicts that maybe we saw during the Cold War?
That's the million-dollar question, Dominic, and I'm going to try and do my best here, but with the biggest caveat possible. And I'm speaking as a professor of war studies here, I cannot think of another form of warfare that is so contentious. Just the very phrase grey zone warfare has become a real academic football that's been kicked about. When you think of other forms of warfare, whether it's sort of proxy warfare or counterinsurgency, you just listed two other types of warfare that I've researched in the past. Everyone is sort of broadly in agreement as to what the parameters of that type of war are. Grey zone conflict and hybrid war really gets academics arguing like no other topic in conflict studies I know, and that's for several reasons. The very idea that it's neither war nor peace, I think, sits quite uncomfortably with a lot of us, that it has some characteristics of conflict, but it's sub-threshold. It doesn't meet that immediate limit of what war actually constitutes in the eyes of the international laws of armed conflict. There's an existential issue here about whether it actually exists or not. And one of the key reasons is partly history. If we take this idea that hybrid warfare or grey zone warfare is largely an amalgamation of different forms of conventional, unconventional, regular, irregular types of activity. We can go all the way back to ancient Rome and go, well, hang on, there are examples of this sort of multiplicity of different activities going on within the same battle space. Hybrid war is nothing new. And I take that point. What I would argue is that hybrid warfare, grey zone conflict, whatever phrase you want to use, that it is actually a really helpful concept and idea to be using, in large part because it helps understand old threats in a new environment. I've been discussing this with many colleagues at many academic conferences and policymakers in Parliament and within NATO, and we've been kicking this idea around as to whether hybrid war is actually a thing. I've settled on this sort of what I think's my own position, whereby I don't deny the fact that we've seen this mishmash of different conventional and unconventional, regular and irregular activities in the same war. Think, for example, about World War I. Everyone thinks muddy trenches across Belgium, but at the same time, Lawrence of Arabia is blowing up trains in the Ottoman Empire as a wannabe insurgent. I'm not going to deny the fact that there are hybrid elements to World War I. For the same reason, if you fast forward to looking at contemporary activities today by the superpowers challenging the United States and NATO, such as Russia, China, Iran, they're using that very same multiplicity of methods. But I think what matters today, what shapes today's environment in the hybrid grey zone space, is that never before has it attained a strategic level of importance, that it's never been used with this regularity, with this level of importance, that is shaping geopolitics substantially.
Yeah, I really like that aspect of the strategic importance of what's being done, and I think that is really quite impactful. And if we look at Russian sabotage operations across Europe, they've, by many different metrics, they've at least tripled between 2023 and 2024. And I think one of the really defining features of grey zone operations is the ambiguity. I think that strategic ambiguity, that really deniability at the highest levels whilst trying to achieve a significant impact, is such a powerful tool. Can you help us understand the deniability and the intent behind states that are really capitalizing on hybrid warfare and grey zone warfare tactics today?
The word you just used there, ambiguity, is central to understanding all of it. Ambiguity is the central characteristic of hybrid war. Is that if you look at the states such as Russia, China, Iran, who are arguably three of the most prodigious users of threats in the grey zone, the reason that they couch their actions in ambiguity is for several reasons. Firstly, is because the resort to hybrid threats allows states to turn weaknesses into strengths. Whether they've got a constrained geopolitical or an economic capacity, that they've not got a large financial resource to be able to undertake large-scale military actions, instead resort to hybrid threats, you can still kind of get what you want in the international system, or at least make a big fuss about it. Secondly, ambiguity is exactly the reason why, in a legal sense, these activities are sub-threshold, that there is no overt direct line of responsibility between the state and the action. And creating that level of uncertainty about attribution, that's key, because the two things to really understand in regards to hybrid threats are the source and the method. And if you can create enough ambiguity about the source of an activity, who was it exactly that cut that underwater cable? Who was it exactly that undertook that cyber attack? Then the multiplicity of different methods help absolutely amplify this constant erosion, and this is what the states want, this constant erosion of security, a constant erosion of norms. This is why one of the sort of attendant issues here is this so-called phrase lawfare, this idea that if a competitor state, a challenger state in the international arena can just erode and push and nudge the norms of international behavior, you erode the foundations of international law, and suddenly you've created enough anarchy to get what you want. So ambiguity is absolutely central, because shrouding is not necessarily a cloak of deniability, because take perhaps the most obvious example of modern hybrid war, rewind to 2014 with the Russian annexation of Crimea, with the so-called little green men who had all their Russian military insignia taken off their shoulders. This sort of veil of deniability was a bit of a joke, but there was enough ambiguity in the actions from the Kremlin to actually hamstring NATO's response, because the ambiguity of who was responsible, who was coordinating, was this a formal state military action, or was it, as Vladimir Putin kept insisting, just the actions of patriotic volunteers in the Crimea? It creates what I like to think of for the target state. It puts the target state on the horns of a dilemma. Because if you over-respond to an ambiguous use of force, you yourself look like you're the aggressor. But if you don't respond enough, you get the erosion of, you get this sort of what we call in academia salami slicing, this sort of notion that your enemy wants to take the whole salami, but you don't take the whole thing at one go. You just slice at a time, and hope nobody notices. And before you know it, they've got what they want. You're left completely vulnerable. And that's why ambiguity is the biggest ally to states who want to utilize hybrid threats.
Yeah, I think that salami analogy is a really good one, and I've been talking about this for years with clients and government agencies about China's actions in the South China Sea. I mean, it's this persistent encroachment and taking advantage of legal ambiguity about how much does a pile of sand that China may have actually laid there themselves on top of a coral reef, actually count as a foundation for a claim for land, and then this militarization of locations. I think it's systematically and persistently taking away and eroding the international law. And I think we see it in the was it the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, about ignoring tribunal rulings. Even cases, there was a case back in 2016 that was won by the Philippines. It was just ignored by China by ignoring economic exclusive zones that are normally legally binding, by militarizing ports, airstrips, coral strips, and then, militarizing coast guards and fishing vessels. I think that is exactly the sort of gray zone tactics that have proved to be very, very effective when we look at the Indo-Pacific region. And so I wonder, what does this tell us about escalation dynamics and our ability to deter these sort of activities?
This is incredibly difficult because responding or even identifying an act of hybrid conflict and providing complete attribution, it's the strategic equivalent of catching fog. You can see it, it's there, but you can't grasp it. And for that reason, deterrence and escalation is incredibly difficult. Firstly, you've just gone and listed a lot of examples that demonstrate that the maritime space is a massively, massively important arena in which hybrid threats are being played out, because that provides an awful lot of recent examples where that ambiguity that we've just been talking about can be manifest. And we've seen examples over the last few years whereby the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy has been repurposing fishing trawlers, filling them with jamming equipment and sailing them close to Indonesian or Filipino naval vessels that are coming near some of these contested islands in the South and East China Sea. Earlier this year, when a fishing trawler, to all intents and purposes, was escorted out of the North Sea off the east coast of the UK because the UK Navy had realised that this fishing trawler just so happened to be going backwards and forwards, seemingly mapping the major area of underwater sea cables linking the UK and mainland Europe. It headed off into the North Sea and was tracked going back into Russian territorial waters. And of course, perhaps one of the most important maritime examples that we've seen over recent years is the way in which the Houthis and their allies, the Iranians, have really been messing with global supply chains through the way in which they're able to create a huge choke point coming up through the Suez Canal because of the way in which, and this was absolutely fascinating, there was a lot of really interesting reports coming out of US intelligence agencies about how an unmarked vessel that was Iranian flag this is at the height of the crisis last year with the Houthi bombings of ships coming through. This vessel had to go for repairs in a port in East Africa, and suddenly the bombing stopped. The normal sea supply chains going through the sea globally resumes. This vessel then left port, returned to the sea, and the bombing started again. And intelligence agencies had realized that actually what was in here was some pretty sophisticated naval analysis, radar and jamming equipment that was passing information back to the Houthis on the mainland to identify ships that could be targeted. So the maritime space is absolutely ripe for exploitation through ambiguous hybrid threats. But how do you deter these? This is a huge question that in my discussions with UK parliamentarians and NATO practitioners who I've worked with for quite a few years on this problem now. Deterrence as a concept, as an idea, really has its roots in modern geopolitics with the issue of nuclear weapons. How do you prevent a nuclear war? And when we talk about deterrence, you need to ensure that the prevention of something happening is because your countermeasures or the possible consequences are stronger than the potential gains that can be made from the action in the first place. That sort of traditional acceptance of risk and reward are completely out of the window when hybrid threats are being used, because ambiguity is central. You don't want necessarily to put your head above the parapet and show the world that you're doing something. So how do you deter something that your competitor doesn't necessarily want to be seen anyway? It's incredibly difficult, and it's also allied largely to this idea that deterrence works in conventional spaces the Cold War remained cold because neither the US nor the Soviet Union wanted to drop nuclear weapons on the other for fear of global nuclear annihilation. Deterrence was clear and obvious. But in the sub-threshold space, in the grey zone, all of that conventional thinking goes out the water. And I don't think conventional thinking about deterrence as an idea, as a concept that grounds international security has really moved forward to translate into this sort of new era where the threats are not conventional, they're not obvious, they're not predominantly nuclear based. They are about undermining elections, they're about cyber attacks, they're about underwater sea cables. And that, I think, right now is the most pressing problem for our politicians today. How do you update and make effective deterrence against hybrid threats?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Andrew. And I'd love to explore something you mentioned earlier around the erosion of public trust and the fear around it. And I think the grey zone tactic of increasingly targeting critical infrastructure is something that does that. I mean, we look at Taiwan's government systems. Now, of course, there's a lot of them, but they're suffering, by some publicly available data, about 2.4 million daily attacks, just repeated attack on attack on attack. Then we see the repeated sabotage of the Baltic undersea cables. I mean, the deliberately exploiting loopholes in the law of the sea. We see that Russia's shadow fleet and these third-party flagged vessels are conducting sabotage operations while still preserving deniability from the Russian state. These tactics are being used to sever undersea gas pipelines, to cut fiber optic cables in the Baltic Sea. Can you help us understand properly, what risks do these tactics pose to our resilience as both democracies, but also what risks do they also pose to authoritarian states that are actually employing these tactics?
The real appeal in the utility of hybrid threats is that they pose a lot less risk to the nation utilizing them, to the Russias, to the Chinas, to the Irans, than they do to the target states on the receiving end of them, the Taiwans, the NATO member states, for example. And that in part is because of this idea that I mentioned earlier about they're turning weaknesses into strengths, and it puts the emphasis on response from those target states, who are then having to actually make their response obvious. To that extent, your previous comment there about escalation becomes key. There is an inherent risk in getting response wrong and escalating along the wrong ladder. In academia, we talk a lot about the ladder of escalation in conflict, right? And it going up incrementally before you get to the top level of the ladder of escalation, which is outright conflict. The issue, though, is directly related to modes of deterrence and levels of resilience. Right now, I don't think levels of resilience across the societies in the West that are on the receiving end of hybrid threats is strong enough. The idea that we need to understand is that resilience is intrinsically linked to deterrence, because the higher the levels of resilience in a society to hybrid threats, the higher the level of deterrence, because it's not having an effect. One of the things we need to understand here is that in political terms, in security terms, there's a lot of talk about how certain issues are referred to as whole of government problems. The thing about hybrid threats and grey zone warfare is that it transcends that. Responding to hybrid threats is a whole of society problem. And that's why we need to think about ways to increase the resilience across societies. It's not just about improving policy response or ensuring that there are greater levels of military funding to help give us a cutting edge on responding to things like cyber attacks. It's about ensuring that everybody is resilient to hybrid threats. And this can be manifested in several ways. In the work that I've been doing over the last few years with NATO, it's become very clear through several studies that they've done that there is a direct correlation between levels of mainstream media literacy in a country and levels of trust in government. And the fact that we are now in a day and age where the majority of people do not get their news from what has now been labeled the mainstream media, and they are instead relying on social media channels to get their news and information, you have massively extenuated the circumstances in which disinformation can reshape political narratives and open up that opportunity to drive a wedge between a society and their government. And this is exactly why hybrid threats, grey zone warfare, it's not just about territories. Earlier I mentioned the annexation of Crimea back in 2014. As a territory grab, that's a bit of an outlier in terms of hybrid activity. The predominant issue is that actually Russia is able to be pumping out disinformation on social media. It's about driving a wedge between the people and the governments in the West, because it's not just about territory, it's about values. It's about norms. And if you can undermine those, you've started to unsettle the very fabric of liberal democratic societies. And that's why this whole spectrum approach to hybrid war, about targeting critical national infrastructure, targeting voting systems, targeting the values that people hold dear collectively, has a much bigger effect than simply grabbing territory. All of them represent different slices of salami that have been taken at each point, and they add up much more to the sum parts of the whole.
Andrew, your work on proxy warfare is really foundational, and I'd love to hear your insight on this. Now, I've had the benefit both in the Middle East, but also in the Indo-Pacific region of actually training and supporting local forces and actually building up their capacity. But I'd love to hear from you and the work you've done and the study you've conducted. When the West does arm, train, and enable local partners, how do we maintain legality, especially when transparency isn't always there? Support from other agencies is often very opaque, and it definitely doesn't reach the public's eye. How do we maintain that, and what lessons have we learned in London and Washington and Canberra about how to successfully conduct these proxy campaigns without further escalating?
I honestly think we need to go back to the invasion of Iraq. Bear with me here, because I think in order to understand the controversies surrounding contemporary local partner force support operations, so-called working by, with, and through other agencies on the ground, we need to understand that the tectonic plates of international security have shifted significantly, even over the last quarter century. If you think about how the American launch of the global war on terror in response to 9/11 created within the Bush administration this desire to undertake massive military operations that launched regime-changing wars in 2 countries in the Middle East, that then suddenly proved to be not only divisive, to be unpopular, and largely unsuccessful. So what changed then when Obama comes into power is an understanding that the large and aggressive and very expensive displays of American military might around the world are actually incredibly counterproductive. But the one thing that wasn't going to change was the ceding of American interest around the world. So what then becomes, and actually I think, an incredibly risk-orientated approach to defense and foreign policy was saying, okay, no more wars, no more regime-changing interventions. And bearing in mind, of course, that one of the greatest foreign policy failures of the Obama administration really was to deal with the Assad regime in Syria at the beginning of the Syrian civil war, the constant ignorance really of Assad crossing these so-called red lines that Obama set time and time again. Obama wasn't going to use force, but he wasn't going to cede American interest. So instead, that's why we then see the US response to the rise of Islamic State not being another major hundreds of thousands of troop operations on the ground, but instead essentially a proxy war approach, where you take a disparate, absolute alphabet soup of militia organizations on the ground, you airdrop them the weapons, you take some of them to Jordan, and you create training camps, and you hope that they can do the job for you in defeating Assad and the Syrian army. At the same time, as they're dropping bombs from the air, and this sort of rather strange half in, half out type approach proved rather unsuccessful in its entirety. It wasn't one or the other. And I think now, actually, it might sound very strange, but there's more in common with Obama's approach to overseas wars and Donald Trump's approach than you might think, because both Obama and Trump were very keen on not undertaking large American wars overseas, at the same time not wanting to cede American interest where they felt it needed defending. So this is why, because of that, because of the failure of the global war on terror as a massive military undertaking, the natural inclination then in subsequent administrations, as diverse as Obama's and Trump's, has been to rely on local partner forces where appropriate, making very strange bedfellows out of a wide range of different insurgent groups, state militaries, non-state groups, to undertake actions that they believe are important for attaining American military strategic objectives. And that's why we're living through this era now of large-scale use of proxy conflict, which is in and of itself part and parcel of the broader spectrum of activities that comes under the banner of hybrid war.
And moving to something that's a little bit closer, that we all see and we all read, and we're not listening to right now, we can say the International Risk Podcast is not supported by any government entities, but we do know that Western governments, and no doubt governments all around the world, really are partnering with different platforms, broadcasters and NGOs in order to counter disinformation. And I think most of us would say that's a good thing. If you're countering disinformation, if you're giving us the facts, that's excellent. But as we've sadly seen since 2016, there really has been this blurred line between what's fact checking, what's censorship, what's just outright bullying, and where's this line between offering support and actually influencing the narrative that gets shared with the civilian population. Andrew, where is this line between healthy government funded support and where does that cross into covert influence? And even if it does cross into covert influence, is that okay? Is that something that we should just be happy and content with that our governments are doing on our behalf?
They've always done it. Let's not hide this fact. The history of the Cold War has a constant and regular level of Western interference in elections, say Greece, Italy, for the prevention of communist governments from being elected. Covert influence is part and parcel of modern statecraft on both sides. Let's not hide from that fact. But what is problematic right now is the way in which populist narratives in the West are undermining efforts to tackle disinformation. The rise of right-wing populism in Europe and the United States is Russia and China's dreams come true, because the ability to label anything that doesn't fit your political agenda as fake news immediately starts to undermine any collective effort to draw a line between information and disinformation. And this is why social media is fertile ground for hybrid activities. I'll go back earlier and re-emphasize the point about media literacy. There is a direct link between people's trust in their governments and people's belief in media narratives. This is where we have to take a bigger step back and think about, well, what's at risk? I don't want to get too hyperbolic here, but there are values at stake about liberal democracy and what we stand for. And the ability to call our governments out on their actions and what they say is an intrinsic part of living in a liberal democracy. And we have to defend that. And here is the crux of the dilemma. How illiberal do liberal democracies need to be in order to protect themselves against misinformation, against cyber attacks? This is why this issue of escalation is completely upended when we talk about this, because you'd see a cyber attack, you're not going to respond with a missile attack. So how do you then keep your response within the confines, not just of the framing of this grey zone, it's not war, it's not peace, but also in a way that protects and defends your liberal value base, your democratic political system? And that's why liberal democracies now have got to think about whether a ladder of escalation needs to be sort of put in place in regards to hybrid threat. Do we need to respond in kind? A cyber attack for a cyber attack? This is problematic because of the way in which, as I said earlier, they're making strengths out of weaknesses. The things that they are attacking, large critical national infrastructure projects, the stealing of billions of dollars worth of intellectual property from higher educational institutions and businesses across the West, they're attacking them because they don't have them. So responding in kind is very, very difficult. It's got to be done in a way that both protects the critical national infrastructure, protects business interests, but also protects the values and the norms that our liberal democracies stand on, because we can't sacrifice those in the name of defending them.
Yeah, it's a really great point, isn't it? How much do we sacrifice in order to pursue what's important to us? How much do we give up of that? I think that's something that too often we don't really ask that question, analyze that enough. And certainly in my experience around the world, strategic flexibility, ambiguity, deniability, risk management, they're all important components of hybrid warfare. Now, you've written extensively on counterinsurgency and proxy warfare. What lessons do you draw and what lessons should we learn from you from past conflicts where states have really sought to fight indirectly and maintain deniability? And what should we be looking for today when we're understanding the international risk environment and the geopolitical environment? What should we be learning from the past and taking into today's activities?
My study of the history of this type of irregular and indirect warfare, such as war by proxy, tells me that when states have a heightened sense of risk, they resort to more indirect forms of warfare. So when it's too risky to send hundreds of thousands of soldiers into another country and undertake large nation building projects, it doesn't mean that the entire goal of controlling or influencing the strategic outcome or the strategic direction of another country is abandoned. It just means the route by which they try and get to that objective changes from direct to indirect. And that's why the Cold War remained cold, because there was that heightened sense of risk about what would happen if too many direct routes were taken to attaining strategic dominance over the other. I mean, we can talk about the Cold War and use that very label in a Western sense because we never saw the bullets fly. But actually, if you talk to historians in Asia, you talk to historians in Africa, the Cold War is not cold. It's a series of hot wars that were fought locally with massive levels of external interference from the superpowers. This I think runs exactly parallel to the pendulum shift that we saw after the failures of Iraq and Afghanistan. It was too high risk to keep undertaking direct forms of regime change or direct forms of military action, but we don't want to give up the strategic interest. So instead, we'll just utilize indirect mechanisms to attain our objectives. So I think we are, and perhaps for quite some time now, have been living through an era of warfare by risk management. Political leaders are heavily attuned, not just to the economic costs of large-scale direct warfighting, but also, of course, to public opinion, which has had an increasing growth and an increasing effect on the way in which politicians in the West manage conflict. I think ever since Lyndon Johnson decided not to run for re-election in 1968, we've seen exactly how public opinion regarding unpopular wars can influence political leadership. And I think this is a broad rule of thumb that we should be conscious of. The recourse to proxy wars, especially in the West, becomes ever more prevalent when the risks of direct intervention are seen to be too high.
European business leaders, I'm continually advocating that they really should be, and I'm not trying to be alarmist, but that they really should be highly concerned about the impacts of hybrid warfare on their companies. The evolving threats from increasingly targeting critical infrastructure, from supply chains, the impacts on logistics, information security, and even societal cohesion, all of which is essential to commerce and successful commerce. Now, perhaps you agree or don't agree with that thesis, but if you do, what do you think business leaders should be doing today in order to prepare their companies so that they have the robustness and the resilience to be able to navigate what is a really complex international environment?
I completely agree with you. Business leaders no longer have the luxury of assuming that they are a place apart from states in terms of being targeted by other states now in the international arena. The rise of hybrid war means that warfare is no longer a purely interstate activity. State militaries are no longer targeting exclusively state militaries. Business leaders in the West don't have the luxury of assuming that they are immune to any of this. And I'm sure that that is not news to many of them because they will have realized that they are already on the receiving end of cyber attacks, for example. The reason why they can't assume that they are immune to this is for several reasons. Firstly, it's just the intrinsically interconnected way in which globalization has meant that the face of the West, as it were, for many are high-profile multinational companies based here. Secondly, we cannot afford to silo the threats that emerge in the hybrid realm of assuming that, well, it's disinformation campaign, so that's a state issue. We cannot afford to silo these things. There have already been several high-profile instances. Take, for example, last year, the series of fires at DHL warehouses at airports. That is an extreme example of Russia pushing the boundaries, finding a way to demonstrate we know where your soft underbelly is, and exploiting it and going, we could do more if we wanted. And unfortunately, DHL were the guinea pigs for demonstrating that. Any company, particularly those who have a stake in or are a part of critical national infrastructure, particularly telecommunication, cannot afford to be complacent. If you think about the fact that roughly 98% of all digital communications require underwater cable passage, then the whole world comes to a grinding halt if there are systematic attacks on those cables. The very fact that life today on an individual social level revolves around internet access, you deny that, fabric of society starts to fall apart. Businesses will be unable to function. This might sound like a Hollywood script ready to be written where hybrid war gets the big Hollywood treatment. Time and time again, Dominic, what we have seen are these sort of Sputnik moments where something that was beyond our imagination happens and it changes everything. The thing is, with hybrid war, there's not been a Sputnik moment. It's been gradual. It's been slowly escalatory, but it is now pervasive. There is nobody out there in public service, in elected office, and hopefully not in boardrooms around the world who can claim that they don't understand the threats posed in the grey zone and what it means for their country and for their business. And that's why I'm trying to build in resilience into either national security infrastructure or to your business is absolutely essential in order to mitigate any effects. Because, as we said earlier, deterrence of these threats is very difficult. In order to make that happen, there's got to be very close public-private cooperation because governments and businesses have got an awful lot to lose. And I would really encourage greater levels of cooperation between the sectors. A loss for one is a loss for the other, and we can't afford to be complacent about that.
Yeah, thanks for raising that, Andrew. When you look around the world, Andrew, what are the international risks that concern you the most?
We can't ignore climate change. Climate change is pervasive. It affects us whether we want to ignore it or not. It will affect us whether we believe in it or not, the way in which it is affecting everything, every aspect of the strategic ability of states to function and exist. On a risk register, the biggest, most outsized items are the existential ones. Nuclear conflict has been carefully managed since 1945 between nations because we assumed that there were rational actors involved in the process, and maybe they still are. Let's not forget that there was, for a time after the Cold War, a movement to get the nuclear weapon nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Existential risk now is largely climate driven. It's forcing migrations. It's forcing countries to think about how they can continue to exist on into the future. And it's also essentially going to have a big impact on how and where business can be done. That for me hangs over everything, including national security, including warfare, because we're going to be thinking about a future in which thousands of tanks that run on an inordinate amount of fuel can no longer be sent into a battlefield because there's no fossil fuels left. We can't be undertaking long-range missile strikes with huge gas-guzzling jets. The climate change agenda is not just about what war looks like, it's about why it's fought. So we're going to need to be thinking about resource wars. If you're talking about what does the future of war look like, resource wars over, not just talking about oil and gas, we're talking about water. These are the constricted resources alongside some of the more rare minerals, an increasing amount of geopolitical competition. We're going to absolutely see more of that, aggressive forms of rare mineral competition. Resource wars are going to be something that we need to look out for, and they are going to bring their own risks that will absolutely be exacerbated by climate change.
Oh, I completely agree with you, Andrew. I actually spoke at the European Risk Management Conference a few years ago, and actually the thesis of what I was talking about was actually about water wars and the impact. And it was very easy to draw plenty of examples from South Asia, from East Africa, but there was actually quite a few examples in Europe of where we're extremely water scarce and the impact on our society. So I definitely agree that we need to be analysing not just how wars are fought, but why they fought. And I think natural resources is a pretty obvious motivator, especially as climate change continues to impact all of us. So thanks for raising that. And thank you very much for coming on the International Risk Podcast today, Andrew.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Dominic. Thank you.
Well, that was a great conversation with Professor Andrew Mumford on the challenges of grey zone warfare and strategic ambiguity and the impact on our societies. Please go to our website and subscribe to our email list to make sure that you get our updates in your inbox every second week. And you can also now find our episodes on YouTube. So if you like watching our content as well as listening to it, please go to YouTube to look at our content there. This episode was produced and coordinated by Katerina Mazzucchelli. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening. We'll speak again in a few days.